Finland, where it's 3 p.m. I'm here in Texas on June 28th, 2021. I'm talking today with Antti Kauhanen, who is a professor in Helsinki, Finland, and an expert on a whole variety of things, including gender issues. I want to ask him several questions about gender. The first one is the standard question. Why is there a pay gap between men and women? What are the causes?
Well, there are several contributing factors. So traditionally, we economists have been concentrating on four. So the first is that the labor markets are segregated. So men and women tend to work in different firms, occupations, and industries. And because the pay rates differ among these fields, that's one cause of the gender wage differences. The other is the human capital explanation. So if men and women differ in terms of their education, work experience, training received, for example, this can generate wage differences. There has been large convergence in all of these factors.
Let me ask you this, though. Yeah. Let me ask this. I mean, you mentioned human capital differences, and yet in most rich countries, women are now more educated than men. And yes, with childcare being increasingly good, women have almost or should have as much experience as men. So why should that matter anymore?
Well, it turns out that it doesn't matter that much anymore. Precisely, the education differences, at least in terms of the level of education, have converged. There's still large differences in the fields of education. And also in terms of work experience, there has been significant convergence.
Let me ask you this. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so then the third explanation is compensating differentials. So in competitive labor markets, jobs should provide about the same level of utility. And so if one job is very unpleasant, it should have a higher wage rate. And if the preferences of men and women differ, that might also contribute to wage differences.
Do you really think that matters in the day where most work is white-collar work? I mean, we're not talking about very many people doing heavy lifting anymore. How important can that be?
Yeah, well, it can take the form of prestige of the job. If you have a very prestigious job, the wage rate could be lower, all else equal.
I find that hard to believe. I like the segregation story to me, and I don't think we stress the segregation enough. Not segregation like racial segregation, but segregation, occupational segregation, to use Barbara Bergman's old term from the 1970s.
Yeah.
I like that story. Let me ask you this, okay? I think an awful lot, very few people discriminate outright against women, or at least they don't think they are. I think an awful lot of discrimination against women by men will be unconscious. Can you give me some examples of that, A, and B, what could be done about it?
Yeah, well, one example comes from hiring. The studies showing that men and women are evaluated differently, especially if they are parents. And so women with children, they are evaluated, for example, in their professional competence as well, in lower terms as women without children, whereas for men, it's the opposite. And this can often be unconscious. And it's, of course, difficult to address it. But one way to address that is to formalize the decision procedures.
In what way? I mean, I know that, for example, there are studies of orchestras where they do blind auditions. It's hard to do that for a job in an office. How could you formalize it to avoid these issues?
Well, to formalize the evaluation criteria, for example, thinking about if you would write a computer program to evaluate the candidates, what kind of program would you write? What are the sort of things to evaluate and thinking in those terms?
It's interesting. So what you're saying is if we could somehow remove people from the decision, at least directly from the decision, then we would solve the problem.
Yeah, and then this brings us to the issue which the latest research has shown that the large part, maybe almost all of the gender wage gap is due to children, or the impact of children on men and women, which differ.
But isn't it also the case that, so couldn't you examine that possibility by looking at women who have been single all their lives compared to men who've been single all their lives? Do we still observe a gender difference there too?
Yeah, well, what recent research has done is to look at the earnings of men and women and what happens before and after the birth of the first child. And across many countries, some Scandinavian, some German-speaking, some English-speaking, you see in all countries that the earnings of men are almost, they are not affected by the birth of the child, whereas women experience big disadvantages. And those are persistent. The magnitude differs a bit across countries, but the dynamics are the same in all countries. Birth of a child leads to a large reduction in earnings.
Let me ask you this, though. I mean, I'm talking from the United States, which record is not that great, but Scandinavia has a reputation of being the best in the world on this. Is that true, or do the same problems arise in Scandinavia and in Finland in particular?
Yeah, the same problems arise. So in the Scandinavian countries, the long-term motherhood penalty is about 20%.
Huh.
Whereas in the US, for example, it's about 30%. In the German-speaking countries, it's about 50 to 60%.
So it is better in Scandinavia, but still pretty bad, it sounds like.
Yeah, and the reasons differ a bit across countries. So in some countries, it comes more from labor force participation. In other, it comes from more reduction in hours, and others in reduction in wage rates. But what I think is very interesting is why the wage rates are reduced. Because women change their occupations and their employers after the birth of the child. So they are seeking more family-friendly occupations and firms. And so you see a large divergence in the career trajectories of men and women.
Can we do anything? I know, for example, I always see stuff from various groups I belong to about making workplaces more family friendly. What does that mean exactly? I know what the result we want is, but what does it mean? How do you actually do it? What does it entail?
Well, that's a very good question. So there's a lot of talk about temporal flexibility nowadays. Because some research has shown that long hours and hours supplied in particular points in time, in inconvenient times, they are greatly rewarded in the labor market. And now the question is that how to break that. What can be done? Well, one thing is to try to make employees more substitutable, so that the customers wouldn't be so they wouldn't want to deal with that particular person, but you could substitute some other employee there. So maybe some kind of teamwork arrangements could be possible there. But this kind of temporal flexibility, maybe remote work is one possibility, makes it easier to combine, for example, childcare responsibilities, working, meaning shorter commutes, for example, and so on and so forth.
That's interesting. The problem is we've seen in the last year and a half with the pandemic that it looks like from the data that the remote work and having the children at home, in fact, makes things even worse for women compared to men, according to some research I've seen.
Yeah, that is.
How does that solve the problem?
Well, this pandemic has, and the resulting recession has been very different to many other recessions in the sense that it has hit women more. One reason is the occupational segregation. So the recession has really hit the service sector, where women tend to be more represented. But also women work more in the essential occupations, such as in healthcare.
Right.
But it has also meant that the closing of schools and all that has meant that home production has increased. There's new educational requirements at home, and those have largely fell on women, and that has made their situation even more difficult.
Do you think that anything will really change until we can change the attitudes of men and women when they marry, that they expect a different kind of set of responsibilities? It seems to me that's got to be the long-term solution, doable.
Well, that's what the recent research tends to show, that it nowadays even economists emphasize the role of norms, and it really seems to be the case here that first of all, the norms are still very, very traditional. If you look at the answer to the question that should women stay at home if they have kids in school age or under, it's, in German-speaking countries, I think the response rates, positive responses to that question must be somewhere in the region of 50% or so. And that's the reason why we see so big, childbirth having so big impact on the careers and earnings of men and women, that the norms are still so strong that women take more care of the kids.
There is a solution, not have children. And I was just yesterday looking at the fertility rate in the United States in the last 20 years. Since 2010, it has fallen from about 2.0 to 1.6. America is having fewer children than we have since the Great Depression. Yeah. Will that help solve the problem, maybe, if we don't have kids anymore?
Well, yeah, that will probably lead to a small convergence in the earnings of men and women, but I don't think that's the solution that many persons will have.
Right.
So, but then the question is that how do you change norms? They change very slowly. And for example, if now suddenly norms change, it takes several decades to work through the labor market. So, well, there's very interesting research from Austria showing that all the parental leave policies and childcare policies since the 50s or 60s have had no impact on gender wage differences. So all those policies, no impact. So that the norms are so strong that it's still the women who take care of the children.
Let me ask you this. We mentioned staying at home. I want to sort of do the remaining part of this discussion about the impact of COVID and the longer term impact of the last year and a half on the gender pay gap. Do you see any link here, or is it just a passing thing that's not going to make any difference?
Well, it can have long-term effects. Well, one is that, if women take more of the home responsibilities now, well, that means that they have less work experience going forward. So that might have long-term impacts. But then, of course, even though the increased home production has fallen mostly on women, it's still men have been taking more responsibilities at home. Maybe that helps going forward. Maybe that helps to change the norms. That remains to be. And if remote working becomes more common, that may help in combining work and family life more flexibly, but that might have a positive impact on the gender wage gap going forward.
Okay, let me ask you this then. Final question, okay?
Yeah.
You've quoted all kinds of research about the extent to which the motherhood penalty exists in different countries. US is sort of in the middle. Scandinavia is one of the best ones on this. In the year 2050, when you're an old man and I'm long since dead, okay, will things be better? Will the motherhood penalty be less? Will the gender wage gap be less? I'm asking you to forecast.
Yeah, it will be, both will be less. Well, the gender wage gap has been, it's been going down for a long time, but at a very slow rate. But this motherhood pay gap, that's more interesting question because it has remained quite stable, and so its importance has increased over time, when the other reasons, such as differences in level of education, have reduced in importance. So in the longer term, I think that the norms will change. Men will take more responsibilities for childcare, and that will equalize the labor markets. But it's going to be slow. So 2050, no.
No.
I think that the situation will be better, but I don't think that men and women will yet be completely equal into it.
That, I think, is somewhat depressing. That's my final question. So let me thank Antti Kauhanen of ETLA in Helsinki for being with me today. Antti, thanks so much. I learned something from talking to you, and I hope our audience did too. Thanks for being with me.
Thanks.